Hello there! Welcome to this tutorial on how to use Geometry Dashboard. So let's get right into it. First thing you see when you open up Geometry Dashboard is this list with generator. And you don't know what they mean. So if you see an error when you first open up Geometry Dashboard, you might see an error. That means you have to go into your preferences and make sure the user config file is set correctly. So then you go to your OSU and you notice some points and maybe lines show up in your objects. These are the geometry generated by Geometry Dashboard. You can interact with this geometry by using the hotkeys. You can set these hotkeys in the preferences, but it's fine to stick with the defaults. The most important ones are the snap key, the select key, and the refresh key. By pressing the snap key, your mouse cursor snaps to the nearest geometry object. This is the main way you're gonna utilize the geometry. Next is the update key, which by default is B. If you change something, the geometry might not update with it right away. Then you press the refresh key to update the geometry. Next up is the select hotkey. Pressing the select hotkey toggle selection on the nearest geometry. You can see this by the yellow outline. Selecting multiple geometry objects causes more geometry to appear. This geometry is related to the geometry you have selected. Take a shot every time I say geometry. You can also snap and select this new geometry. Some of the stuff you see here is the triangle position, the square right angle position, the equal distance circles, the bisector, the line through these 2 points, the next point in line, the middle point. Very useful stuff. You can also lock geometry with Shift N. If you lock a geometry object, it becomes gray. Locked objects will never disappear. They also have special interactions with a few generators. For instance, if I select a locked point, then this locked point will mirror any geometry on the screen in this one point. You can also remove locked object by using the lock hotkey on them again. If you have a line and lock it and select it, this will mirror geometry over the line. Very useful for making symmetries. The name of the game is to use the geometries in a smart way to make your life easier. The geometry which gets generated and shown on screen is determined by these generators. There are 3 classes of generators: basic, intermediate, and advanced. Basic generators generate geometry objects from actual hit objects in your editor. For instance, the points on slider anchors generator generates points on the anchors of sliders. These points were all generated by this generator. The intermediate generators generate geometry based on other geometry and not hit objects. For instance, the lines by 2 points generator generates lines on each pair of 2 points. It is also configured with the input selection to need selected objects. That means it will ignore all objects which are not selected. That's why if I select 2 points, a line will be generated which goes through them. The advanced generators are basically the same as the intermediate generators, but they have more advanced interactions, like the reflection, scale and rotate around a fixed point, or these generators which need more than 2 points. There's even a generator which generates intersection points. Here you can faintly see one of these intersection points. Why is it so faint? The intersection generator is configured to make each point generated by this generator 1.4 times as bright as the parent geometry. You can also use these buttons to quickly toggle selection, locked, and usability on all geometry. This is useful if you, for instance, want to make a grid and you lock all the objects making up your grid. For making a hex grid, I recommend disabling all other generators except the ones generating triangles, specifically the type 1 triangle generator. You can then add an input selection rule that allows objects generated by the generator itself. This means it accepts selected objects or objects generated by this generator. This introduces recursion. You can now see more triangle points are generated. If we increase the inception level, this recursion can go even further. I will now lock all points by shift clicking this lock button. We now have a hex grid we can use while mapping. We can also save our configuration of locked objects and load them at a later time. You might find it annoying to always see all this geometry on your screen while you're not using it. For that, there's an option. We can tell Geometry Dashboard to show nothing while the snap hotkey is not pressed. Now, when we're in game, we don't see any geometry, but it's still there. When we press the snap hotkey, we can snap to the geometry, which is still there, and it shows the geometry we just snapped to. We can also see the parents which generated this geometry, which gives some context. You might notice that it automatically refreshes when you scroll through the timeline. This is because updating is configured to happen at any time change. You can tell Geometry Dashboard to only update when you use the hotkey. This is the most flexible option, as you can use geometry from way long ago. You can also customize the way geometry looks on your screen. For points, lines and circles, you can change the color, the opacity, the thickness, the dash style and the size of these objects. If you open another tool, then Geometry Dashboard will no longer be active. However, you can tell it to stay active even when other tools are currently selected by checking the Keep Running toggle. Now Geometry Dashboard will stay running even while using other tools, like Slider Completionator. Also, you can enable this toggle to see the playfield boundary on your overlay. This boundary is exactly the playfield boundary when you're playing on the 4:3 aspect ratio. This makes it easy to make sliders which do not go off screen. That's about it for this tutorial. Thanks for watching.